The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 did not just deploy soldiers in uniform, it unleashed a different kind of force, a shadow army that would soon outnumber the official military presence. These were private military contractors, or PMCs. They came from all over the world, drawn by the promise of high pay and, honestly, the adrenaline of a war zone. By 2008, the Pentagon itself counted nearly 156,000 contractors on its payroll in Iraq. At that point, there were more private contractors on the ground than there were U.S. soldiers. This was a fundamental shift in how America waged war, turning critical military functions over to private corporations. This vast contractor army was not a monolithic entity. It was a complex ecosystem of companies and individuals performing a wide array of jobs once reserved for the military. The largest group, making up over 60% of the total, handled logistics and base support. They cooked the food, drove the supply trucks, did the laundry, and maintained the sprawling military bases that dotted the Iraqi landscape. But a significant and highly visible portion, about 18%, were armed security contractors. These were the men who protected diplomats, guarded key installations, and escorted convoys through the most dangerous roads in the country. Their presence really blurred the lines between civilian work and active combat. The use of so many contractors created a landscape of confusion and tension. They operated outside the traditional military chain of command, answering to corporate managers instead of generals. This separation created immense challenges for coordination and oversight on the battlefield. U.S. military commanders often had little to no authority over the armed contractors operating in their sectors, leading to a chaotic and dangerous environment. Early warning signs of the problems this could cause appeared with the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, where contractor involvement in interrogations highlighted a dangerous lack of clear rules and accountability for these private forces. The sheer scale of this privatization was unprecedented in modern American history. The U.S. was essentially running two parallel armies in Iraq, one public and one private. The public army wore the flag on their shoulders and were subject to military law. The private army wore company logos and existed in a legal gray area, a world of immense power with very little oversight. This experiment in outsourcing war would have profound and lasting consequences, not just for the people of Iraq, but for the very nature of how powerful nations project their force across the globe, a reality that would soon be defined by companies like Blackwater. The decision to rely so heavily on private military contractors was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy choice driven by several key factors. First and foremost, the U.S. was fighting with an all-volunteer military, which placed significant strain on its forces. After the initial invasion, the military was stretched thin between occupying Iraq and fighting a war in Afghanistan. Contractors offered a way to surge a massive number of personnel into the theater of war without needing to institute a draft or call up more reserves. It was a way to boost manpower quickly and quietly, avoiding the political debates that would come with a formal increase in troop levels. Secondly, using contractors provided a layer of political insulation for Washington. The casualties of private contractors were not reported with the same solemnity as those of uniformed soldiers. Their deaths did not appear in the official Department of Defense daily casualty reports, keeping the true human cost of the war partially hidden from the American public. This allowed the government to sustain a long-term occupation with less domestic political backlash. When a contractor was killed, it was a corporate loss, not a national one. This cynical calculus made the prolonged conflict more politically palatable back home, masking the full price being paid in blood. The roles these contractors filled were essential to the war effort. They were not just security guards, they were the backbone of the entire operation. They performed everything from training the new Iraqi police and army to maintaining sophisticated weapon systems, like Predator drones and Apache helicopters. They built and guarded the bases, managed the supply chains that fed and armed the soldiers, and provided personal security for the top U.S. officials running the occupation. In essence, the U.S. military could not have functioned in Iraq on the scale that it did without this private army working alongside it, making privatization an indispensable component of the mission. Ultimately, the turn to PMCs was presented as a smart, efficient, and modern way to conduct military operations. Proponents argued that private companies, driven by competition and the profit motive, could do these jobs more cheaply and effectively than the government. It was an application of free market principles to the battlefield. However, this logic overlooked the dangerous implications of outsourcing violence. It created a powerful industry that had a financial stake in the continuation of conflict. This new model of warfare raised urgent questions about accountability, ethics, and who truly benefits when war becomes a for-profit enterprise. In the ecosystem of private warfare that flourished in Iraq, one name became more infamous than any other: Blackwater. Founded in 1997 by former Navy SEAL Eric Prince, Blackwater USA began as a firearms and security training facility in North Carolina. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the company's fortunes skyrocketed. It positioned itself as a key partner in the new war on terror, securing over $1 billion in U.S. government contracts. Blackwater was not just a security company, it was a private army for hire, equipped with its own helicopters, armored vehicles, and a roster of highly trained special operations veterans. The company's big break in Iraq came in August 2003. It was awarded a $21 million no-bid contract to provide personal security for Paul Bremer, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority and America's top official in the country. This single contract placed Blackwater at the very center of power in occupied Iraq. Its role quickly expanded, and it became the State Department's primary security provider under a massive program called the Worldwide Personal Protective Services, or WPPS. Between 2001 and 2006 alone, Blackwater earned more than $832 million protecting American diplomats and officials, becoming a symbol of the privatized war. On the streets of Baghdad, Blackwater's presence was impossible to miss. Their operators, often clad in tactical gear and sunglasses, traveled in heavily armored convoys of SUVs, driving aggressively and brandishing military-grade weapons. They projected an image of overwhelming force, a deliberate strategy to deter attacks. At its peak, the company had around 1,000 personnel deployed in Iraq, acting as a private Praetorian Guard for the American diplomatic mission. They operated with a level of autonomy and firepower that was virtually indistinguishable from elite military units, but without the same rules of engagement or accountability. As its power and visibility grew, so did its controversial reputation. The company was involved in hundreds of shooting incidents, but it was difficult for Iraqis to seek justice. Many saw Blackwater's operators as an arrogant and unaccountable occupying force, acting with impunity. The company's aggressive tactics created deep resentment among the local population, undermining the U.S. mission to win hearts and minds. This simmering anger would eventually explode into an international incident in the middle of a crowded Baghdad square, forever cementing Blackwater's legacy of violence and controversy. On a bright, sunny afternoon in Baghdad, the normal chaos of traffic in Nisour Square was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire. It was September 16, 2007. A heavily armed Blackwater convoy, made up of 4 armored vehicles and given the call sign Raven 23, had entered the bustling intersection while responding to a nearby car bomb explosion. The team was tasked with securing a location for a U.S. diplomat's meeting. What happened next would become one of the most notorious events of the entire Iraq War. A brutal display of violence that would be seen around the world and came to be known as the Nisour Square massacre. As the convoy established a blocking position in the square, its operators began to open fire. They used a lethal combination of machine guns, sniper rifles, and even grenade launchers against the civilian cars and people around them. The shooting was relentless and indiscriminate. Panic erupted as drivers and pedestrians tried desperately to flee the kill zone. Cars were riddled with bullets, some catching fire. One vehicle, carrying a doctor and her adult son, a medical student, was targeted. As it slowly approached the square, both were killed instantly. Their car, unable to stop, continued to roll forward and was hit again and again. The violence lasted for roughly 15 minutes. When the shooting finally stopped and the Raven 23 convoy departed the scene, the square was a horrifying tableau of death and destruction. At least 17 Iraqi civilians were dead, including women and young children. One of the victims was a 9-year-old boy named Ali Kinani, who was shot in the head as he sat in the back of his father's car. More than 20 other civilians were wounded, many of them severely. In the midst of all this carnage, not a single Blackwater contractor was injured. They had not taken a single bullet in return. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and outrage. The Iraqi government was furious, calling the shooting a criminal act and an unprovoked massacre of innocent people. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki immediately moved to revoke Blackwater's license to operate in the country, demanding that the men responsible be brought to justice. The incident laid bare the brutal reality of relying on unaccountable private armies. For many Iraqis, and for people around the world, Nisour Square became the ultimate symbol of the lawlessness and impunity that defined the private contractor industry in a time of war. In the wake of the Nisour Square massacre, two starkly different narratives emerged. Blackwater and its defenders immediately claimed that the contractors had acted in self-defense. The company's official position was that the Raven 23 convoy had come under attack from insurgents. They argued that their men responded appropriately to what they perceived as a credible threat, including small arms fire and a potential car bomb. According to this version of events, the operators were heroes who bravely defended themselves and the American diplomats they were assigned to protect, and any civilian deaths were the tragic but unavoidable collateral damage of a complex urban firefight. This self-defense claim, however, quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Iraqi witnesses and the Iraqi government's own investigation painted a completely different picture. They described an unprovoked attack, a one-sided slaughter where heavily armed foreigners opened fire on unarmed civilians who were simply trying to go about their day. Iraqi investigators found no evidence that the Blackwater convoy had been fired upon. This account was soon bolstered by the United States military itself. A preliminary U.S. military report concluded that Blackwater's use of force was excessive and that the contractors had not been targeted by hostile fire before they began shooting into the crowded square. The decisive investigation was ultimately conducted by the FBI, who sent agents to Baghdad to collect evidence and interview dozens of witnesses. Their findings were damning. The FBI report concluded that at least 14 of the 17 deaths were completely unjustified and violated the rules for the use of deadly force that applied to U.S. security personnel in Iraq. The investigation found no proof to support Blackwater's claim of an ambush. Instead, it revealed a story of panicked and aggressive contractors who unleashed a terrifying amount of firepower on innocent people, including those who were trying to flee or were already wounded. The battle over the truth of what happened in Nisour Square highlighted the deep chasm between the contractors' perception of the world and the reality experienced by the Iraqi people. Blackwater operators were trained to see threats everywhere, to prioritize their own security above all else, and to respond to any perceived danger with overwhelming force. But in a crowded city square, this aggressive posture proved deadly. The conflicting stories revealed a system where private actors, motivated by profit and a warrior ethos, could inflict terrible violence and then attempt to justify it with a narrative that had little basis in fact. Bringing the Blackwater contractors responsible for the Nisour Square massacre to justice proved to be an incredibly difficult and prolonged legal battle. One major obstacle was the question of jurisdiction. Since these men were private contractors, they weren't subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which governs the conduct of U.S. soldiers. They were civilians, but the crimes had been committed in Iraq, which, honestly, created a legal black hole. At first, a U.S. judge dismissed the initial indictment against the guards, arguing that prosecutors had improperly used statements the men were forced to give to State Department investigators right after the shooting. That decision sparked outrage and really reinforced, the idea that contractors were basically untouchable. However, prosecutors didn't give up. They successfully appealed the dismissal and eventually brought new charges against 4 of the Blackwater guards involved, using a law called the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, or MAJA. This law, which was expanded after the Iraq War, was designed to cover contractors working for the U.S. government. After a long and difficult trial, a federal jury in Washington, D.C. reached a verdict in 2014, 7 years after the killings. One guard, Nicholas Slatton, who was accused of firing the first shots, was convicted of first-degree murder. The other 3, Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurd, were convicted of voluntary manslaughter and weapons charges. The sentences were severe. Slatton received a mandatory life sentence for his murder conviction. The other 3 men each got 30 years in prison. For the families of the victims, and for many observers around the world, these verdicts felt like a long overdue moment of accountability. It seemed to prove that American justice could, eventually, reach even the most powerful private military contractors. It sent a message that operating in a war zone didn't grant anyone a license to kill with impunity. The convictions were hailed as a landmark victory for the rule of law over the privatized violence that had run rampant in Iraq. But that victory was ultimately erased. In December 2020, President Donald Trump issued full presidential pardons to all 4 of the convicted Blackwater guards. In an instant, the years of investigations, trials, and legal battles were rendered meaningless. The men were released from prison, their convictions wiped away. The decision was met with international condemnation. The Iraqi government called it a violation of human rights that ignored the dignity of the victims. For the families, it was a devastating blow, a final confirmation that the American system valued the lives of its contractors more than the lives of innocent Iraqis. The pardons reignited the global debate about contractor impunity and deeply damaged America's moral credibility. The Nisour Square massacre and its aftermath raised some really profound ethical questions about the very nature of outsourcing lethal force. In theory, a nation's military is supposed to be guided by a sense of duty, patriotism, and a strict code of conduct. Soldiers fight for their country. Private military contractors, on the other hand, are employees of a for-profit corporation. Their primary motivation is financial. As one former Blackwater employee, Morgan Lorette, bluntly stated, "Contractors are profiteers or mercenaries, driven by money, not a national cause." This fundamental difference creates a serious ethical problem. Can a profit-driven entity be trusted to wield the power of life and death responsibly and ethically on behalf of a nation? This ethical dilemma was made worse by the culture that developed within companies like Blackwater. They recruited heavily from former special operations forces, creating an elite, hyper-aggressive warrior culture. While this made them effective at protecting their clients, it also fostered an US versus them mentality that often viewed all Iraqis as potential threats. This mindset, combined with a lack of meaningful oversight and accountability, created a perfect storm for tragedies like Nisour Square. When violence becomes a product to be sold, and the customer is a government wanting security at any cost, the moral lines can become dangerously blurred for those pulling the trigger. The damage to the United States' reputation was immense and long-lasting. The massacre, and especially the eventual pardons, reinforced a narrative that America didn't value Iraqi lives. It fed into anti-American sentiment across the Middle East and really undermined the stated U.S. goals of promoting democracy and the rule of law. How could the U.S. claim to be bringing freedom and justice to Iraq when its own agents could kill civilians in broad daylight and ultimately face no consequences? The incident became a powerful recruiting tool for insurgent groups who pointed to Blackwater's actions as proof of the brutal and unjust nature of the American occupation. Beyond the immediate damage, the Blackwater saga exposed the corrupting influence of money in warfare. It highlighted the risk of creating a permanent mercenary class that profits from instability and conflict. The high salaries paid to contractors, often many times what a U.S. soldier earns, created resentment within the military itself. The reliance on these private forces also led to coordination failures, and even friendly fire incidents on the battlefield. Ultimately, the moral cost of privatizing war was a loss of control, a tarnished reputation, and the normalization of a system where violence became just another service to be bought and sold on the open market. The international outrage following the Nisour Square massacre forced the U.S. government and the international community to confront the legal vacuum in which private military companies operated. The incident really served as a dramatic wake-up call, showing that the existing system of oversight was completely inadequate. In response, the U.S. Congress held a series of high-profile hearings, bringing in Blackwater founder Eric Prince to answer tough questions about his company's conduct. These hearings shed a public light on the shadowy world of war contracting and generated significant political pressure for reform, as lawmakers realized they had allowed a powerful private force to operate with minimal supervision. This pressure led to some concrete legal and regulatory changes. One of the most important was the expansion of the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. or MAJA. This law was amended to close the loophole that had made it so difficult to prosecute contractors, clarifying that civilian employees and contractors working for any U.S. government agency in a war zone could be tried in U.S. federal courts. The State Department also tightened its rules for security contractors, increasing its oversight of their operations, clarifying the rules for the use of force, and improving coordination between private security details and the U.S. military to prevent future tragedies and communication breakdowns. Beyond U.S. law, the Blackwater case spurred the development of international standards. In 2008, the Montreux Document was created, an international agreement that reaffirmed the obligations of states under international law to regulate the activities of private military companies. While not legally binding, it provided a framework for best practices. This was followed by the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, a multi-stakeholder initiative that established human rights and professional standards for the industry. Companies that sign on to the code agree to be monitored by an oversight body, creating a mechanism for accountability that had been sorely lacking. Despite these reforms, the debate over the use of private military companies continues. Critics argue that these new rules and codes of conduct are still insufficient. They point out that a voluntary code is no substitute for binding international law, and that as long as there is a market for private armies, there will be companies willing to operate in the gray areas. The core dilemma remains: can an industry that profits from war ever be truly and effectively regulated? The pardoning of the Nisour Square guards showed that even when the legal system works, political will can override justice, leaving many to question whether real accountability is ever possible. The story of Blackwater in Iraq offers a powerful and cautionary lesson about the profound risks of privatizing war. It really demonstrates what can happen when the state outsources its monopoly on violence to for-profit entities that operate outside the traditional structures of military discipline and public accountability. The massacre in Nisour Square wasn't just an isolated incident caused by a few rogue individuals. It was the predictable outcome of a system that prioritized force protection and corporate interests over human rights and the rule of law. It showed the world that a lack of oversight, combined with a culture of impunity, is a recipe for disaster. The legacy of Blackwater has actually reshaped the landscape of modern conflict. The company itself was forced to rebrand multiple times to escape its toxic reputation, first as Z Services, then as Academy, before being absorbed into the larger Constellis Group. Yet, the industry it helped create is larger and more sophisticated than ever. The model of using private contractors for security, logistics, and even combat support roles has become a permanent feature of warfare for the U.S. and other nations. The debate is no longer about whether to use contractors, but how to control them and ensure they are held accountable for their actions, a challenge that remains largely unresolved. This enduring challenge is vividly illustrated by recent events. In 2024 and 2025, as Haiti descended into catastrophic gang violence, the country's embattled government reportedly turned to a familiar face for help: Eric Prince. Now, the head of a new company called Vectus Global, Prince was hired to provide security solutions, including deploying drones and training Haitian forces to restore order. This development sent a chill through human rights organizations, who warned that deploying a private force with a history tied to Blackwater into such a volatile environment, without robust international oversight, risks repeating the mistakes of the past on a new stage. The shadow of Nisour Square thus stretches from the streets of Baghdad to the crisis in Port-au-Prince. It serves as a constant reminder of the dangers of unaccountable power and the moral compromises inherent in for-profit warfare. The story of Blackwater is a clear warning that while private military contractors may offer a tempting, seemingly easy solution to complex security problems, the price can be devastatingly high. And it is a price paid not by the corporations or the governments that hire them, but by ordinary people like those who lost their lives on a sunny afternoon in a Baghdad traffic circle.